The horrifying reality of living under the Emperor's children is worse than any nightmare you can imagine. I know because I lived it. My name is Jorvan Hale. Once I was just a data worker in our city's administration. Now I am the last witness. When their purple and gold ships appeared in our skies, we welcomed them with celebrations. We did not understand that their perfect faces hid monsters beneath. The screams of my neighbors became their favorite music. Human bodies were carved into living instruments that played melodies of pain. Those of us who survived learned to move like rats through the shadows of our broken city, always listening for the sound of their processions. The worst part was not the killing. It was how they made beauty from our suffering, turned our agony into art that could entrance even as it destroyed. I thought I could hide forever. I was wrong. What happens when the very gods of excess claim not just your flesh, but your reality itself? My name is Jorvan Hale, though names mean little now in Civitas Voluptas, the city of 1,000 pleasures. That is what they renamed our capital after the fall. Before their coming, I worked as a municipal data collector, tracking resource distribution for our governor. A small life, but mine. We had heard rumors of the Great Crusade, whispers of compliance and the Emperor's light. We prepared celebrations for when his warriors would arrive, not knowing which of his legions would claim us. When the ships appeared in orbit, they bore the purple and gold of the Emperor's children, the perfectionist sons of Fulgrim, known across the galaxy for their precision and glory. We lined the streets. We sang hymns of welcome. Some wept with joy. Our musicians prepared their finest works, knowing this legion's appreciation for such things. The first drop pods crashed through our atmosphere on a clear morning. I remember how the sunlight caught on their armor as they emerged, iridescent and beautiful. Their weapons stayed holstered. Their voices were melodic when they spoke, each word precisely chosen. They requested our leaders come forward to discuss terms of peaceful compliance. I watched from my hab window as our governor and his council approached the Legion commander. The warrior removed his helmet, revealing a face of such impossible symmetry and grace that many gasped. I remember thinking that surely we were blessed to be welcomed by such perfect examples of humanity. I did not see the blade that took our governor's head. I only saw the fountain of crimson that followed, and heard the strange, pleased sigh that escaped the Legionnaire's lips as the blood splashed across his armor. What came next happened with such speed and deliberate grace that it seemed choreographed, as if they had practiced the movements 1,000 times. The white marble streets of our processional avenue became slick with blood. The screams rose like a chorus, and the warriors began to move differently, their bodies swaying as if keeping time with the sounds of terror. Some began to sing, their voices impossibly beautiful, harmonizing with the death cries of our people. I ran through service tunnels and maintenance shafts. I made my way home and gathered what supplies I could, food, water, my identification documents, though these would soon become worthless. From my high window I could see the Legion moving through the city, their progress marked by rising smoke and strange colored lights that pulsed in patterns that hurt my eyes. That was 3 years ago. I live now in the shadows of what was once Administratum District 6. Most buildings stand empty, their inhabitants processed for whatever entertainments the Legion devised. Those of us who remain have learned to move like vermin, silent and unseen. We are not resistors, we are not rebels, we are simply those who have not yet been caught. I keep this record because I must believe someone will find it someday, that someone will know what happened here, that our suffering will be witnessed even if it cannot be avenged. This is not a tale of heroism. There are no heroes in Civitas Voluptas. There is only survival, and what we surrender to achieve it. My first months in hiding were spent alone, moving from one abandoned hab to another, staying ahead of the patrols. I learned their rhythms, the strange rituals that dictated their movements through the city. They did not hunt us constantly. That would be too simple, too merciful. Instead, they staged great spectacles, processions they called revelations, where they would sweep through a district and capture any survivors they found. I witnessed one such revelation from the ventilation crawl space of what had been a Medicaid facility. They moved in perfect formation, their armor no longer the proud purple and gold of the Emperor's children, but twisted into configurations that defied reason. Some had modified their armor to expose flesh beneath, skin covered in swirling tattoos that seemed to move of their own accord. Others had attached sound amplifiers that broadcast their every footfall, every breath, magnified to painful volumes. They drove before them a procession of captured citizens, bound together with chains made not of metal, but what appeared to be sinew and nerve tissue that pulsed with unnatural life. The captives moved in a strange unified gait, their steps perfectly synchronized despite their terror. Those who faltered were not killed. Instead, one of the warriors would approach, bearing a small silver case. From this he would extract a vial of shimmering liquid and force the captive to drink. The effects were immediate and horrifying. The subject's body would contort, bones cracking as they realigned, skin would stretch and split, revealing new growths beneath. But through it all, their consciousness remained. I could see it in their eyes, the awareness, the understanding of what was happening to them. Some screamed, others begged, a few laughed, a sound more terrifying than any cry of pain. I watched as one woman, perhaps my age, was transformed. Her fingers elongated until they resembled the strings of some grotesque instrument. Her ribcage opened like petals of a flower, revealing lung tissue that had reshaped itself into something resembling bellows. One of the legionnaires approached her, drawing a bow-like implement across her finger strings. The sound that emerged was beautiful, hauntingly so, a melody that brought tears to my eyes even as it turned my stomach. "Perfect," the legionnaire whispered, his voice amplified by his helm's vox. "You shall play in the grand symphony. Your voice will join the cacophony of bliss." The procession continued, and I remained hidden, my hand pressed against my mouth to stifle any sound. Hours passed before they moved beyond my hiding place. Only then did I allow myself to breathe, to weep, to shake with the horror of what I had witnessed. That night, I found I could not sleep. The melody played by the woman's transformed body echoed in my mind. I found myself humming it, then caught myself and bit my tongue until I tasted blood. This was their power, I realized. Not just the physical corruption, but how they made beauty from horror. How they turned the profane into something that could touch the soul. In the days that followed, I began to notice changes in the city itself. Buildings were being reshaped, their structures altered to create new acoustic properties. Great amphitheaters rose in what had been residential districts. Towering speakers were mounted on spires, broadcasting sounds at all hours, sounds that defied description, oscillating between painful screeches and melodies so beautiful they could stop your heart. I learned to stuff my ears with fabric scavenged from abandoned habitations. It dampened the sounds, but could not block them entirely. Some frequencies seemed to bypass the ears altogether, resonating directly in the bones of my skull, in the cavities of my chest. Food became scarce. The Legion had little interest in maintaining supply lines or food production. Their warriors did not seem to eat as humans do. The few functioning food distribution centers were traps, places where the desperate would gather, only to be harvested for whatever twisted purpose the Legion had conceived. I survived on stocks of emergency rations found in abandoned security outposts, on hydroponically grown fungi that flourished in the damp, dark places where I hid. Sometimes I would find others like me, survivors eking out an existence in the shadows. We would share resources when we could, information always, but we never stayed together long. Groups were easier to detect, and the Legion had ways of making captives reveal the locations of others. One man I met, an engineer named Drusus, had been working on mapping the Legion's movements, trying to understand their patterns. He believed there was logic to their madness, a method that if understood might be used to predict where they would go, when it might be safe to move. "They're creating something," he told me, his voice a hoarse whisper as we crouched in the ruins of a water reclamation plant. "Not just capturing people, not just killing. All of this, the sounds, the architecture they're building, the transformations, it's all part of some greater work." I asked him what he meant. What purpose could possibly be served by such random cruelty? "Not random," he insisted. "Deliberate, orchestrated. They're tuning the city itself like an instrument, and we are the notes they wish to play." 3 days later, I found Drusus's body, or what remained of it. He had been opened from throat to groin, his internal organs removed and replaced with mechanical devices that continued to click and whir even in death. His mouth had been sewn open, fixed in a permanent scream, and from it emerged a soft, continuous tone, like a flute played by the wind. Around his neck hung a placard inscribed with flowing script, "The disharmonious are retuned." I buried him as best I could in the soft earth of what had once been a decorative garden. I took his notes, his maps, his observations of Legion movements. I did not understand all of his technical annotations, but I began to see the patterns he had identified. Certain districts were more active at specific times. Certain buildings had been designated for specific purposes. The Legion had divided the city into sections they called movements, each with its own theme, its own particular brand of horror. In the first movement, the commercial district, they had established what they termed sensation markets, where captives were subjected to escalating experiments in pain and pleasure. The second movement, once our cultural center, now housed the galleries of transformation, where the most extensive physical modifications were performed. The third movement, the industrial sector, had become a vast workshop where Legion artificers crafted new instruments of torture disguised as art. And so it continued, each district repurposed for some aspect of their grand design. Drusus had identified 8 movements in total, with a 9th under construction in what had been our central administrative complex. I began to use this information to navigate the city more safely, to time my movements when Legion activity was focused elsewhere. It was during one such carefully planned excursion, seeking medical supplies from an abandoned clinic, that I encountered Maris. She had once been a medicae, specializing in trauma surgery. Now she operated a small underground network, treating those she could, providing palliative care for those beyond help. She had established her clinic in the sublevels of a collapsed hab block, the rubble above providing both concealment and protection. "They don't just kill," she told me as she treated a fungal infection that had spread across my back. "That would be too simple, too final. They want subjects, experiments, audiences. They want witnesses to their artistry." Her hands were gentle, her touch clinical and impersonal, but it was the first human contact I had experienced in months that wasn't born of fear or necessity. I found myself telling her about Drusus, about his maps and theories. "He was right," she said, examining the papers I had brought. "They're building something. The city is becoming an instrument, and we are becoming the music. But to what end?" She introduced me to others, who had found sanctuary with her. A former conductor from our Philharmonic, a sound engineer who had worked in our Vox broadcast facilities, a mathematician who had lectured at our principal university. Together they had been studying the Legion's activities, trying to understand the patterns, the purpose behind the madness. The conductor, a thin man named Gallus, whose fingers never stopped moving, as if constantly keeping time to some unheard melody, explained their findings. "It's a summoning," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All of this, the sounds they're creating, the harmonics they're establishing throughout the city, the people they're transforming, it's all designed to thin the veil between real space and the warp. I didn't understand. I was not versed in such matters. I knew of the warp as the means by which void ships traveled between stars, nothing more." The mathematician, Lorelei, tried to explain in terms I might grasp. "Imagine reality as a fabric," she said. "Normally, it's tightly woven, keeping us separate from what lies beyond. But certain patterns, certain frequencies and geometries can weaken that fabric, create resonances that allow things to pass through. What things? I asked. The sound engineer, a man called Thax, who had replaced one of his eyes with an augmentic recording device, answered, Entities, beings, the things that live in the spaces between spaces, the gods they worship. This was madness, I thought. Tales to frighten children. But I had seen enough impossible things since the Legion's arrival that I could not entirely dismiss their words. What can be done? I asked. How can we stop it? They exchanged glances, a silent communication born of long association. We can't, Maris said finally. The work is too far advanced, their control too complete. But we can document it. We can bear witness. We can ensure that whatever happens here, whatever they accomplish, someone will know. And so I joined their small collective, their fellowship of observers. We established a system of surveillance using Drusus's maps to position watchers at key locations throughout the city. We recorded what we saw, what we heard, compiling a record of the Legion's activities, their rituals, their transformations of both the city's architecture and its remaining population. What we documented defies simple description. The Legion had begun organizing what they called performances, elaborate spectacles that combined elements of religious ceremony, theatrical presentation, and public torture. These were held in the newly constructed amphitheaters, with captive audiences arranged in concentric rings around a central stage. During one such performance witnessed by Thax from a concealed observation point in the amphitheater's upper reaches, the Legion presented what they termed the Symphony of Ascension. 50 captives were brought to the stage, each already modified in some grotesque fashion. Some had been given extra limbs. Others had their senses enhanced to impossible degrees. Their eyes multiplied, their ears reshaped into elaborate spirals that covered the sides of their heads. The Legion conductor, a warrior whose armor had been reshaped to resemble an exploding ribcage with bone-like protrusions extending outward in all directions, directed them to form a precise geometric pattern on the stage. Then, at his signal, they began to move, to vocalize, to play upon each other, as if each was an instrument, and collectively they formed an orchestra. The sounds they produced began as discordant noise, painful to hear. But slowly, as the performance continued, the discord resolved into harmony, the separate parts finding a unified whole. The audience, comprised of both Legion warriors and captured civilians, responded with increasing agitation. Some began to sway in their seats, others to speak in tongues. Blood flowed from the eyes and ears of many. And then came the climax. The conductor raised his hands, now transformed into elongated blade-like appendages, and brought them down in a single decisive gesture. At that moment, every performer on stage underwent a simultaneous transformation. Their bodies seemed to liquefy, flowing together into a single mass of flesh and sensation. Screams turned to sighs, then to song. A melody that Thax reported caused him to experience visions of impossible landscapes and beings of incomprehensible geometry. At the center of this mass, a rift began to form, a tear in the very air. Through it poured a light that was not light, a radiance that darkened rather than illuminated. And from this rift emerged something. Thax's recording device failed at this point, the augmentic eye bursting in its socket. He fled, barely escaping with his life, his mind fractured by what he had glimpsed. When he returned to our sanctuary, he could not speak for days. When finally he found his voice, he would say only, "It comes." The Prince of Pleasure turns his gaze upon us. In the weeks that followed, the Legion's activities intensified. More districts were transformed, more citizens captured and reshaped. The sounds broadcast from the city's towers changed, becoming more complex, more insistent, worming their way into dreams and waking thoughts alike. Gallus was the first of our group to succumb. We found him one morning, his body contorted into an impossible shape, every joint dislocated and reset at unnatural angles. His mouth was stretched in what might have been agony or ecstasy. It was impossible to tell. Clutched in his hand was a page of sheet music. the notations unlike any conventional system, the marks resembling more wounds than notes. Lorelei studied it before we burned it along with Gallus's remains. "It's a fragment," she said, "a piece of some larger composition." He was transcribing what he heard. We moved our sanctuary after that, abandoning the sublevels for an atmospheric processing facility on the city's edge. The air there was thick with chemical residue, burning the lungs and stinging the eyes. But the white noise of the still-functioning machinery helped to block the city's broadcast signals. Our number dwindled. Thax disappeared during a reconnaissance mission, leaving only his recording equipment behind. The footage showed nothing but static and brief, disjointed images of faces pressed against the inside of the lens, as if trying to emerge from the device itself. Lorelei lasted longer, her logical mind perhaps providing some defense against the influences pervading the city, but mathematics offered only so much protection. One night she began drawing equations on the walls, complex formulae that spiraled outward from a central point. When Maris tried to stop her, Lorelei attacked, her face transformed by an expression of rapturous understanding. "The pattern is complete," she said, her voice layered with harmonics that should have been impossible for a human throat to produce. "The equation balances. All that remains is the final proof." She took her own life before we could restrain her, using a shard of broken glass to open her veins. As her blood flowed, it followed the lines of her equations, filling them as if the mathematical symbols were channels designed specifically for this purpose. Now only Maris and I remained, two witnesses in a city of horrors. We continued our documentation, our observation, though to what end I no longer knew. The Legion's work was reaching its culmination. The ninth movement, the central administrative complex, had been transformed into a vast spiral structure that rose higher than any building had stood before. At its apex, a crystal spire caught and fractured the light, sending beams of impossible color across the city. "It's a beacon," Maris said as we observed from our new hiding place, "a lighthouse calling across the warp." The Legion had announced a final performance, what they called the crescendo of communion. Heralds moved through the city, their voices amplified to reach even the deepest hiding places, proclaiming that all were invited, all would be welcome, all would participate in the grand finale of their work. We knew then that the end was near, that whatever they had planned would soon come to fruition. We made our preparations, gathering what documentation we had compiled, sealing it in containers designed to withstand extreme conditions. Maris believed that eventually someone would come. Other forces of the Imperium, perhaps drawn by the silence of a world that had ceased all communication with its neighbors. They must know what happened here, she insisted. They must understand what the Legion has become, what they serve. The night before the crescendo, Maris came to me with a syringe filled with clear liquid. "A mercy," she explained. "If we're captured, if there's no other way out, it's quick and as painless as anything can be in this place." I took it, tucking it into the inner pocket of my tattered administratum uniform. The fabric, once a point of pride, now hung in stained rags around my emaciated frame. Still I kept it, some part of me clinging to the identity it represented. Jorvan Hale, administratum worker, citizen, human. That night, as we made final preparations, the Legion began their procession through the city. Even from our distant vantage, we could hear them coming, a march that resonated through the ground, up through the soles of our feet, into our bones and teeth. With the procession came music, if such a word could describe the sounds that filled the air. It was beautiful and terrible, a composition that caught at something primal in the mind, that spoke to desires never acknowledged, to hungers never named. Maris clutched at her head, her face contorting. "Don't listen," she gasped. "Focus on something else, anything else." But there was nothing else. The music consumed all other sound, all other thought. It promised answers to questions I had never thought to ask, pleasures I had never dared to imagine. I found myself moving toward the door of our sanctuary, Drawn by a compulsion I could neither understand nor resist. Maris grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into flesh with desperate strength. "Jorvin," she said, my name seeming to come from a great distance. "Jorvin, use the syringe now before it's too late." I looked at her, this woman who had become my only companion in a world of madness, and I saw that she had already used her own dose. Her pupils were dilating, her breathing slowing. She smiled, a genuine expression that contained neither hysteria nor despair. "Witness," she whispered. And then she was gone, her body slumping to the floor. I should have followed her example. I should have used the mercy she had provided. Instead, I stepped over her body and walked out into the night toward the music that called me with such sweet insistence. The streets were filled with people, survivors like myself who had hidden for months or years, now moving as one toward the central spire. Their faces showed the same compulsion that drove me, the same inability to resist the call. Some wept as they walked. Others sang along with the music, their voices adding new harmonies to the composition. I walked among them, part of them, yet still separate enough to observe, to record in my mind what I was witnessing. This, I told myself, was my purpose: to see, to remember, to bear witness. As Maris had said with her dying breath, the procession led to the base of the spiral structure where great doors stood open, pulsing with light that seemed to beat in time with the music. Legion warriors stood at attention, their armor now so modified that they barely resembled the proud space marines who had first descended upon our world. Their flesh merged with their plate, with instruments and amplifiers, with devices of unknown purpose. They did not stop us as we entered, did not speak or acknowledge our presence, except to guide us toward the central chamber. The interior of the structure defied architectural logic, spaces expanding where they should have contracted, corridors looping back upon themselves in impossible configurations. Finally, we emerged into a vast amphitheater, larger than should have been possible within the confines of the building. Tier upon tier of seats surrounded a central stage, and these were already filled with thousands of spectators, some human, some so transformed that humanity was merely a distant memory. I found myself guided to a seat, my body complying while my mind screamed in silent protest. On either side of me sat others from the procession, their expressions ranging from terror to ecstatic anticipation. On the stage stood a single figure, a Legion commander whose armor had been reshaped into something resembling an orchestra conductor's formal attire, if such attire were made of living flesh and screaming faces. His helmet was gone, revealing a face of perfect, terrible beauty, its features symmetrical to a degree that hurt to look upon. He raised his hands, and the music, which had been building steadily, suddenly ceased, leaving a silence so profound that I could hear the beating of my own heart, the rush of blood in my veins. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space without need of amplification. "Welcome to the crescendo of communion, the final movement in our grand composition. For years we have prepared this world, this city, tuning it to resonate with the harmonies of the warp. Today we complete that work. Today we open the way for our patron, the Prince of Pleasure, the Lord of Excess, the perfect reflection." Around the stage, Legion warriors took positions, each bearing an instrument fashioned from flesh and metal, from bone and sinew. At a gesture from the conductor they began to play, a discordant noise that gradually resolved into complex interwoven melodies. And as they played, the air above the stage began to shimmer, to ripple like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. Colors swirled, impossible geometries taking shape and dissolving, reforming in new configurations. The conductor turned to face the audience, his expression one of transcendent joy. "Feel his approach," he cried. "Open yourselves to his touch, his blessing, his perfect corruption." A wave of sensation swept through the amphitheater, a tide of feeling so intense that many in the audience convulsed, their bodies unable to contain the extremity of experience. Pleasure and pain intermingled, until they became indistinguishable from one another. Each sensation amplified beyond human tolerance, beyond human comprehension. I felt it too, this overwhelming tide. It broke against my mind like a tsunami, threatening to sweep away all that I was, all that I had been. In that moment I understood what the Legion had become, what they served, and the true nature of the horror they had brought to our world. They were not warriors anymore, not conquerors or even torturers. They were artists, composers working in the medium of human sensation, human transformation, and their canvas was reality itself, the fabric of existence that separated the material universe from the realm of their God. The rift above the stage widened, a tear in the world through which something was emerging. I could not look directly at it, my mind refusing to process what my eyes perceived. But I could feel its presence, its attention turning toward the amphitheater, toward us, its assembled worshippers and sacrifices. In that moment of clarity, of understanding, I found the strength to move. My hand went to my pocket, to the syringe Maris had given me, the mercy, the escape. But as my fingers closed around it, another hand caught my wrist. I turned to see the person seated beside me, a woman whose features were vaguely familiar beneath the alterations that had been performed upon her. "Jorvin," she said, her voice distorted by the new configuration of her mouth, the multiple tongues that writhed behind her teeth. It took me a moment to recognize her. Ilara, a fellow administrative worker, someone I had passed in corridors and nodded to in data sanctums. Never a friend, barely an acquaintance, but now the only familiar face in a sea of strangers. "Ilara," I whispered, "what have they done to you?" She smiled, an expression made grotesque by her modifications. "They have improved me," she said. "They have helped me hear the music as it is meant to be heard. And now I help them find others who need improvement." Her grip on my wrist tightened, her strength far greater than her slight frame suggested. With her free hand she raised a small silver device and pressed it to her throat. "An unprocessed one," she said, her voice suddenly amplified, cutting through the music. "In Section 7, Row 12. The music did not stop, but I felt attention shift, focus narrowing upon me. The conductor turned, his perfect face registering first surprise, then pleasure. "Bring him," he commanded, and legionnaires moved through the audience, their massive forms navigating the crowded space with unnatural grace. I struggled against Ilara's grip, finally breaking free, only to find myself surrounded by warriors in twisted armor. They seized me, lifting me bodily from my seat, carrying me down toward the stage. The audience watched, their expressions ranging from sympathy to eagerness. Some reached out as I passed, their fingers brushing against me as if to take something, some essence or energy. On the stage, the conductor awaited, his hands still moving in time with the music, still directing the opening of the rift. As I was brought before him, he paused, turning his full attention to me. "A pure specimen," he said, his voice resonating within my skull rather than reaching my ears. "Untainted, unmarked, a blank canvas preserved until this perfect moment." He reached out, one finger tracing the line of my jaw. His touch was like fire and ice, agony and ecstasy compressed into a single point of contact. I screamed, the sound lost in the crescendo of the music. "You shall have the honor," he continued, "of being the final note in our composition, the last brushstroke in our masterpiece. Through you, the veil will part completely. Through your transformation, the way will be opened." He gestured, and more legionnaires approached, bearing instruments of torture disguised as medical implements, as artistic tools. I saw scalpels and needles, saws and clamps, all crafted with an attention to aesthetic detail that made their purpose no less horrifying. "Prepare him," the conductor ordered, turning back to the rift, to the entity that was emerging by degrees, its presence awash upon reality. They laid me on a table that had risen from the stage floor, securing my limbs with restraints that felt like living things that tightened in response to my struggles. One of the legionnaires, his armor a grotesque parody of a medicae's robes, leaned over me, his faceplate retracted to reveal features that had once been human, but were now stretched and reshaped into a permanent expression of ecstatic concentration. "Rejoice," he whispered as he selected a scalpel from his instruments. "Few are granted the privilege of such transformation. You will become art. You will become music. You will become a conduit for divinity." The blade descended, its edge catching the impossible light from the rift. I closed my eyes, not wanting the last thing I saw to be my own violation, my own unmaking. But even with eyes closed, I could still see the blade's descent, the eager faces of the legion, the widening rift, and what waited beyond it. All were visible to some sense that transcended ordinary sight. The scalpel touched my skin, and with that first incision, something broke within me. Not my resolve, not my sanity, though both had been tested beyond their limits. No, what broke was some barrier between perception and understanding, between experience and knowledge. I saw the legion as they truly were, not as they appeared in physical form. I saw the corruption that had taken their perfect bodies, their disciplined minds, and twisted them into servants of excess and sensation. I saw the entity they worshipped, the being they sought to bring into our reality, not as some abstract concept or symbolic figure, but as a presence that defied categorization, that existed as pure experience, pure sensation. And in that moment of clarity, of terrible understanding, I found not despair, but a strange serene acceptance. This was the truth of our universe, the reality behind the veil of ordinary perception. There were gods in the warp, entities of unimaginable power and incomprehensible nature, and they hungered for the material realm, for the sensations and experiences only physical existence could provide. The legion had become their instruments, their artists and composers, working to reshape reality itself into a form more pleasing to their patron. And I, Jorvan Hale, unremarkable administrative worker, was to be the final component in their grand design, the key that would unlock the door between worlds. The scalpel continued its work, tracing patterns on my flesh that corresponded to the music still playing around us. Each cut, each modification was performed with exquisite precision, with an artist's attention to detail. They were not merely torturing me, they were transforming me, reshaping me according to some pattern I could not comprehend, but could feel taking form with each incision, each alteration. The pain was beyond description, beyond the capacity of human nervous systems to process. Yet I remained conscious, remained aware, my mind expanding to accommodate sensations that should have driven me mad, should have mercifully shut down my awareness. I heard my own voice joining the music, screams becoming notes in the composition. I felt my body changing, not just from the legion's ministrations, but from within, cells and tissues responding to the proximity of the warp, to the influence of the entity emerging through the rift. The conductor moved around me as I was transformed, his hands guiding the legionnaires in their work, his voice offering commentary and direction. "The resonance is perfect," he said at one point. "The flesh responds as it should. The patterns align with the harmonics we have established." Time lost meaning. I existed in a state of pure sensation, pure transformation. I was no longer Jorvan Hale, no longer human in any meaningful sense. I was becoming an instrument, a conduit, a living gateway between realities. And then suddenly everything stopped. The music, the pain, the transformation. A silence fell, so complete that it seemed like a physical presence, a weight pressing down upon the amphitheater. The conductor stood frozen, his face registering shock, then fear. He turned toward the rift, which had begun to contract rather than expand, its edges pulling inward, the colors and geometries destabilizing. "No," he whispered, his perfect voice cracking. "No, this is not possible. The calculations were exact, the resonance is perfect. From beyond the rift came a sound, a note of such profound wrongness that it caused physical pain to all who heard it. The audience clutched at their ears, their throats, their chests, as if the sound were a solid thing forcing its way into their bodies. The conductor fell to his knees, blood streaming from his eyes, his nose, his ears. "My Lord," he gasped, "we have failed you. Forgive us. Guide us to correct our error." But there was no forgiveness from beyond the rift, only that terrible sound, that note of negation and rejection. The entity that had been emerging began to withdraw, its presence diminishing, the weight of its attention lifting from the amphitheater. With its withdrawal came a backlash of energies, a rebound effect as the thinned barrier between real space and the warp suddenly reasserted itself. The rift contracted violently, collapsing inward with a sound like the death cry of a star. The shockwave rippled outward, striking first the conductor, then the legionnaires around him, then spreading to the audience. Wherever it touched, it brought transformation of a different kind, a reversal or perversion of the changes the Legion had worked so hard to create. The conductor's perfect face melted like wax, features running together, reforming in random, hideous configurations. His armor, which had been a masterpiece of corruption and enhancement, began to twist and buckle, crushing the body within. Around me, the legionnaires suffered similar fates. Some collapsed into themselves, their modified bodies imploding as if consumed from within. Others expanded, bloating and rupturing in sprays of fluid that steamed where it touched the stage. The audience was not spared. Their screams now were purely of terror and agony, without the undertone of ecstasy that had characterized their earlier vocalizations. I lay on the table, still bound, still transformed, watching as the amphitheater descended into chaos. The restraints that held me loosened as whatever consciousness had animated them died. I pulled free, my body responding strangely to my commands. I looked down at myself, trying to comprehend what I had become. My flesh had been reshaped, incisions forming patterns across my torso and limbs. Some wounds had been sealed with metal filaments that pulsed with fading energy. Others remained open, yet did not bleed. The edges fused and cauterized. I could feel new structures within my body, additions and modifications whose purpose I could not fathom. But I was still myself, still Jorvan Hale, still conscious, still possessed of my own will. The transformation had been interrupted before it could be completed, before I could be fully converted into whatever conduit or instrument the Legion had intended. I stood on legs that felt too long, too jointed, and made my way across the stage. The conductor lay nearby, his body still twitching as the armor continued its collapse, grinding bone and organ into paste. His eyes found mine, recognition flaring briefly. The god rejected us. He gurgled through a mouth that now occupied most of the left side of his face. Our work was found wanting, imperfect. He reached out with a hand that was more talon than human appendage. "Kill me," he pleaded. "Grant me the final sensation." I looked at him, this being who had brought such horror to my world, who had transformed existence itself into an experiment in sensation and corruption. I felt no pity, no mercy, only a cold, clear certainty. "No," I said, my voice strange in my altered throat. "Live with your imperfection." I left him there, making my way through the chaos of the amphitheater. The structure itself was beginning to collapse, its impossible geometries becoming unstable as the warp energies that had sustained them dissipated. Chunks of ceiling fell, crushing those below. Walls bulged and buckled. Floors rippled and split. The audience was fleeing, those who still could. Some had been too altered by the Legion's earlier work to move normally, crawling or slithering toward exits that seemed to shift and relocate as the building's internal logic failed. Others were simply trampled in the panic, bodies crushed underfoot. I moved against the tide, my altered form providing strength and resilience I had not possessed before. I had no clear destination in mind, only a driving need to escape, to survive, to bear witness to whatever came after. I found an exit, a doorway that led not to corridors but directly outside to the base of the spiral structure. The city beyond was in turmoil. The amplifiers and broadcast towers were emitting bursts of discordant noise, random fragments of the music that had filled the air earlier. Buildings reshaped by the Legion were collapsing or transforming again, their new configurations even less aligned with natural law. In the sky above, the crystal spire at the apex of the spiral structure was fracturing, shards raining down on the city below. Each fragment caught and refracted light, sending beams of impossible color through the air like solid things, slicing through whatever they touched. I moved through streets littered with debris and bodies, past scenes of desperate flight and horrible transformation. Some citizens, those who had been only partially modified by the Legion, were reverting to more human forms, though rarely completely and never without cost. Others, those whose alterations had been more extensive, were suffering grotesque further changes, their bodies rebelling against the conflicting influences of warp energy and material reality. Legionnaires were scattered throughout the city, some continuing their work even as the grand design collapsed around them, others turning on each other in rage or despair. I witnessed a warrior whose armor had fused with his flesh, turning him into a grotesque amalgamation of ceramite and meat, tearing apart a fellow legionnaire with hands that were more industrial tools than human appendages. "Imperfect," he screamed as he worked, "all imperfect. We must remake, rebuild, begin again. I avoided them when I could, hid when I could not." My altered form made me less immediately recognizable as unprocessed, as a potential subject for their attentions. To their eyes, I might have appeared as just another of their works, another transformed citizen stumbling through the chaos. I made my way toward the edge of the city, toward the atmospheric processing facility where Maris and I had established our last sanctuary. I do not know why I returned there. Perhaps some instinct drove me to the last place I had known safety, however relative, however temporary. Perhaps I simply needed to confirm what I already knew, that Maris was gone, that I was now truly alone. The facility stood as we had left it, untouched by the collapse occurring within the city proper. The chemical haze surrounding it had perhaps protected it, making it unattractive to the Legion's aesthetic sensibilities, too industrial, too functional to be incorporated into their grand design. I entered, moving through familiar corridors to the chamber where I had left Maris. Her body remained undisturbed, her face still composed in that final serene smile. I sat beside her, my altered form folding into configurations that should have been impossible, should have been painful, but which now felt natural. I witnessed, I told her, though she could not hear. I saw it all, the performance, the rift, the entity, and I saw it reject them, reject their work. I saw it all collapse. I remained there for hours or perhaps days. Time had become difficult to track, my perception altered along with my body. Eventually hunger drove me to move, to search for sustenance. The supplies we had gathered were still there, untouched. I ate, finding that my altered digestive system could still process ordinary food, though it derived little satisfaction from it. In the days that followed, I ventured out occasionally, watching the city from a distance. The collapse continued, a slow unraveling rather than a sudden catastrophe. The Legion presence diminished gradually. Some warriors departed in dropships that rose to meet vessels in orbit. Others simply disappeared, perhaps seeking new venues for their artistry, new stages for their performances. Those citizens who survived began to emerge from hiding, to reclaim what could be reclaimed of their city, their lives. Many bore the marks of the Legion's attention, modifications both subtle and extreme. They moved differently now, these survivors, keeping to shadows, avoiding open spaces, gathering in small groups that would disperse at the first sign of danger. I observed them but did not join them. My transformation, though incomplete, had left me too altered, too obviously touched by the Legion's work. I feared their reaction, their rejection, or worse, their worship, for some had begun to form cults around the experience, around the memory of the sensations the Legion had introduced. They gathered in the ruins of the amphitheaters, recreating fragments of the performances, seeking to recapture some echo of that terrible ecstasy. Instead, I remained in my sanctuary, venturing out only when necessary for supplies or observation. I compiled what I had witnessed, what I had experienced, recording it as best I could with hands not designed for holding writing implements. I used materials salvaged from the facility, technical manuals and data slates repurposed as journals, as testimony. Months passed. The city stabilized, though it would never return to what it had been before the Legion's arrival. Too much had been altered. Too many had been changed. New structures grew in the ruins of the old, strange, hybrid architectures that combined the practical necessities of survival with echoes of the Legion's aesthetic. The populace adapted, as humans always do. They developed new customs, new social structures to accommodate their altered reality. Those most severely transformed formed their own communities, finding ways to function despite their modifications. Others, those less visibly changed, attempted to recreate the routines and institutions of the before time, establishing markets, governing councils, defensive militias. I watched it all from a distance, a silent observer, the last witness to the full arc of our world's violation and partial recovery. I knew that someday others would come, imperial forces drawn by the silence of a once compliant world, or perhaps by distress signals, sent by those citizens with the technical knowledge to reach beyond our atmosphere. When they arrived, they would find a population forever marked by the Legion's presence, a city whose very stones bore the imprint of their corruption. They would see the cults, the mutations, the lingering influence of warp energies. They would make their judgments, enforce their imperial creed of purity and conformity. I did not expect mercy from these future arrivals. The Imperium's response to corruption, to taint, is well documented. Fire cleanses all sin. But until that day of judgment, I would continue my observation, my documentation. I would bear witness not just to what had been done to us, but to how we survived it, how we rebuilt from the ruins of perfection. 1 year to the day after the failed crescendo, I ventured closer to the city center than I had dared previously. I was drawn by reports, whispered among the survivors I sometimes traded with, of activity at the ruined spiral structure, activity that echoed the Legion's patterns. I approached cautiously, using the network of ruins and abandoned tunnels that I had mapped during my months of observation. The structure still stood, though much diminished, its spiral form partially collapsed, the crystal spire long since shattered. But light glowed within, pulsing in complex patterns that stirred uncomfortable memories. I found a vantage point in the hollow shell of what had once been a commercial tower, using my altered vision to peer across the intervening distance. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. A group had gathered in the ruins of the amphitheater. Some were former citizens bearing the marks of the Legion's modifications. Others were new arrivals, void crew perhaps from passing vessels, lured by rumors of transcendent experience. And moving among them, directing their efforts, were figures in purple and gold armor. Not Legion warriors, but humans dressed in crude approximations of their livery. They were recreating the ritual, these devotees, rebuilding the stage, positioning amplifiers and resonators, marking out the geometric patterns that had been used in the original performance. Their resources were limited, their understanding incomplete. They worked from fragmentary memories, from corrupted recordings, from the half-understood ravings of those who had witnessed the crescendo, and survived with minds at least partially intact. But their devotion was absolute, their dedication to the principle of perfect sensation, perfect experience, undiminished by the failure of the original ritual. They believed, these cultists, that the Legion had simply made some small error in execution, some minor flaw in the composition that could be identified and corrected. I watched them work day after day, gradually reassembling the components of catastrophe. They lacked the Legion's resources, their warp-touched artistry, their transhuman capabilities, but they compensated with numbers, with fanaticism, with a willingness to sacrifice whatever and whoever was necessary to achieve their goal. I knew I should leave, should retreat to my sanctuary and wait for the inevitable failure of their efforts. No human could recreate what the Legion had attempted, could channel the energies they had manipulated. These cultists were doomed to disappointment at best, to horrible death at worst. But I remained, compelled by the same need to witness that had driven me since the beginning. I had seen the full cycle of the Legion's work, from arrival to catastrophic failure. I needed to see this epilogue, this human coda to their inhuman composition. The cultists completed their preparations and began their performance, a pale imitation of the original crescendo. Their music was discordant, lacking the warp-touched harmonies that had made the Legion's composition so compelling, so transformative. Their rituals were clumsy approximations based on misunderstood observations and corrupted memories. I watched, waiting for the inevitable moment when their failure would become apparent, when their borrowed aesthetic would collapse under the weight of reality's resistance. And yet, as their performance continued, I began to sense something shifting, some change in the quality of light, in the propagation of sound. They were achieving something, these devoted amateurs, not the full manifestation the Legion had attempted, not the complete thinning of the veil between realities, but a partial success, a minor weakening, a small rent in the fabric of existence. Above their makeshift stage, the air began to shimmer, to ripple in patterns reminiscent of the original rift. Colors swirled, geometries formed and dissolved. And through this disturbance, something looked back. Something noticed their efforts, their devotion. I felt its attention, its regard sweeping over the assembled cultists, over the ruined city beyond, and briefly over my observation post. I experienced again that terrible moment of clarity, of understanding beyond what human minds were meant to comprehend. The entity was aware of this world, this city. The Legion's work had marked it, had made it visible across the boundaries between realities, and though the original ritual had failed, had been rejected as imperfect, the impression remained. The connection, however tenuous, still existed. The cultists felt it too, this attention. They responded with increasing fervor, their movements becoming more frantic, their vocalizations more extreme.